Now, I've already did a video kind of similar to this a few months ago, comparing, you know, Wilt versus Shaq. But I want to give my reasons even further why I think that in a hypothetical matchup between these two players, these two great individual NBA players, I think Wilt Chamberlain would have a distinct advantage. Because I just, because somebody, and one of my, might have been a subscriber of mine, maybe just been a person who watches my videos from time to time, he gave a counter argument as to why he disagrees with me and thinks that Shaq has the advantage. And generally speaking, he says the same things most people tend to say, that Wilt never played up against somebody with that size, 370 pounds. Now, let's get one thing straight. We got to figure out which version of Shaq is going to go against Wilt. Okay, we have to determine that. Is it the version of Shaq that played in Orlando? Let's say, for instance, the 93-94 version. The 94-95 versions. Shaq when he had the sideburns with, what they call it, the floating sideburns when they had the bald head. Like that version of Shaq who was about 305. When he was quicker, faster, a little bit better leaper, a better rebounder? Or are we going against the Shaq in the Laker years when he was as high as 370, even though he was listed 340? He was up to, the heaviest he ever played in was 370. Then he played, lost weight throughout the season and got down to maybe about 350 or so. But are we talking about that Shaq who was bigger, who was stronger, but he wasn't quite as explosive, and he definitely lost a lot of his defensive ability and leaping ability? Now, what Shaq is it? Because if we're going against for instance, the bigger Shaq, which I guess is what people are talking about. Now, if we're going against the bigger Shaq versus, let's say, the smaller Wilt, who came to the NBA about 258 or so, then the strength argument is a little bit closer, but Wilt was still stronger. Athletically, of course, the advantage goes overwhelmingly to Wilt Chamberlain. And this is the thing that I think people got to understand. Shaq was a very strong person. Okay, the guy could bench at his peak close to 450 pounds. But one thing people forget about Shaq is that his core strength, meaning the strength like toward, I say, his butt area, middle part of his section, midsection of his body. Okay. His core strength, upper legs, wasn't as strong as you would think it would be. I remember when he was traded to Phoenix. Was he traded to Phoenix? I think he was traded to Phoenix. And when the Phoenix trainer worked with Shaq, he was surprised at how relatively weak Shaq's core strength was. And he tried to work with that with Shaq. I can recall vividly many games where a guy who has very strong core strength, like a Dennis Rodman, was able, and Dennis was like 6'8", 220 pounds at this time. A little bit bigger than he was with Detroit, but he was by no means a giant, NBA terms. He was able to effectively guard Shaq. He was able to keep Shaq just far enough out, with his core strength, just far enough away from the basket to give Shaq some problems. Now, we're talking about Dennis Rodman, who was 6'8", 220, versus Wilt Chamberlain, who at that time, like I said, was 7'1", 260, and could bench press well over 400 pounds with a great amount of core strength. See, Wilt didn't just have upper body strength. Wilt had strength distributed throughout his whole body. I thought I've said in my videos before that around the early portion of Wilt's career, 1959, 1960, it was a situation where one of the general managers or something for one of the NBA franchises or whatever, might have been for the Philadelphia Warriors, had a flat tire and he didn't have a car jack. And Wilt Chamberlain offered to help. And the guy was like, what do you mean by that? And he said Wilt proceeded to get down behind the car, squat down, and he said with some exertion, Wilt was lifting the vehicle off the ground. And he told Wilt, stop, because he thought that Wilt was going to, pull a groin. And this is Wilt before he implemented weightlifting and weight training. And Wilt didn't just bench press. Wilt did extensive weight training throughout his whole body, which is, if you've noticed, Wilt lower legs got bigger as well. He never had huge. That's the thing. Like, people look at Wilt's body and then they make a judgment as to, Shaq was this size. Wilt was total muscle. There was no fat on the guy. Not until the very end of his career with the Lakers did you see any type of visible fat on him. And it still wasn't much. Maybe like 8% body fat or something like that. Whereas, this is a guy who for many years only had 4 or 5% body fat. Now, if you're talking about Wilt by the Laker years, then you're talking about a guy who was 7'1", 306, 310 pounds, 315 pounds, all muscle virtually. You're talking about a guy who was now benching 550, 570 pounds, deadlifting 625. You're talking about a guy who, by almost acclamation, was one of the strongest persons in the world. And you're talking about him guarding Shaq. It would be no contest. Also, if you're talking about the bigger Shaq, which I think most people are talking about, Wilt, just his sheer play would wear Shaq out. Shaq is a guy that played one season. He admitted this. He played one season where he played over 40 minutes a game. And he said he felt like he was going to pass out sometimes out there. He was so exhausted. And you're talking about comparing that to a guy, Wilt Chamberlain, who played every season of his career over 40 minutes a game, averaged 42 minutes a game, I believe. No, he averaged 45 minutes a game for his career. 45 minutes a game. His low seasons, he averaged 42. His peak years, he was averaging between 46 and 48 minutes a game. And he wasn't, by no means was he playing at a slow pace. He would wear Shaq out. And I don't understand, unless you're just a Shaq apologist or a Shaq fan, I don't understand why you can't figure this out. Shaq would not be able to contain Wilt Chamberlain. I'm not saying that Wilt would shut Shaq down. Shaq's going to get his. But more often than not, Wilt's going to dominate that matchup. I've told you guys before, Robert Parrish played against both Artis Gilmore and Shaq. And he would tell you Artis Gilmore was stronger than Shaq. He said Shaq was more athletic, but Artis Gilmore was stronger. And it's pretty much a given, and the consensus is that Gilmore was not as strong as Wilt. And Gilmore will tell you that. So it's just common sense. Wilt Chamberlain would bully Shaq around. And all these people who keep poo-pooing Wilt, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. A lot of these guys on radio, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Or they do, and they just got agendas. I love Andre Agassi. I couldn't stand Pete Sampras. Couldn't stand him. But I have to admit, that Sampras is a superior tennis player. I'm not biased. People keep thinking I'm biased, man. I'm giving you my opinion, my honest opinion, and I try to support it with facts or something. Not just saying, oh, I think this guy's this and that, and he's not going to make it because this era and that era. You know, I try to think these things through deeply. That's another thing or two I want to tell a lot of people who are old school fans of basketball. Whenever you run into a person who says something like, well, you know, Dominique Wilkins will be able to make it today because he didn't have a three-point shot. Okay? This is what you should tell these guys. Number one, Dominique Wilkins was born in 1960. All right? So, you imagine he probably started playing basketball when he was 9, 10 years old, maybe. You know, I don't know. I'm assuming he probably played in some type of competitive nature of basketball sometime in the early to mid 1970s in school. You know what I mean? Ask him, where was the three-point shot at then? Was it even in existence? It was in the ABA, but there was no three-point shot in high school. There was no three-point shot in college. So this guy's played all these years of basketball without a three-point shot. He had already developed his game, as did a Michael Jordan, as did a George Gervin, as did all these other players who grew up in the 60s or 50s or into the 70s. Alex English, Adrian Dantley. Basketball then was all about getting the highest percentage shot, getting the best shot. The three-point shot was first implemented in the NBA in 1979-1980. All these players have already developed their games. It was only through playing in the NBA, usually as these guys began to athletically diminish, then they began to implement a three-point shot into the game. But by that time, they generally were on the downside of their career, okay? As opposed to players who were born after 1980, grow up with a three-point shot. Remember, college, the three-point shot was instituted in 1985-86, I believe it was. 1986, I think. 1986. After 1986. So, if you're born in the 80s or late 80s, you grew up with that shot. You get to shoot that shot, you know, every single day. So it makes sense that you're going to be a better three-point shooter. But if you take Dominique Wilkins, you take Michael Jordan, you take all these guys and have them being born 20 years later, they'd be just as good three-point shooters as the guys playing now. It's common sense. It's just like as if the NBA decided to implement a four-point shot. Half-court shots or four-point shots. Guys who are born now, little babies, they're going to be better four-point shooters than even Stephen Curry now because they're going to be working on practicing that shot. The shots, there's no reason to practice that shot now because it's still just 3 points. You get what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Think this shit out, man, before you make these stupid arguments. And I'm done.